Reality is brought to you in part by the climate resilient water sector in Grenada and Hobbarts.
Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the premiere of our newest initiative here at the GBN, our Climate Change Reality. It's a new initiative coming out of the importance of the variations in our climate patterns. This evening, folks, we have two very special guests with us, which we will introduce to you shortly. And I am assisted tonight, co-hosted by Dr. Terence Walters. The planet's average surface temperature has risen about 2 degrees Fahrenheit since the late 19th century, a change driven largely by increased carbon dioxide emissions into the atmosphere and other human activities. Most of the warming occurred in the past 40 years, with the 7 most recent years being the warmest. The years 2016 and 2020 are tied for the warmest year on record. Climate change and global warming are often used interchangeably, but have distinct meanings. Similarly, the terms weather and climate are sometimes confused, though they refer to events with broadly different spatial and time scales. While Earth's climate has changed throughout its history, current warming is happening at a rate not seen in the past 10,000 years. When we come back, we'll ask our guests to share with you briefly something about themselves, and then we get into our discussion this evening. We'll be back in a moment.
Someone to help you to your feet. I'll be that beacon to your highest peak. Oh, I'll be right next to you. No, I will never leave. Come on, take my hands. We got everything we need. Cause you can look to me whenever you're in need. Just call on me and I'll be on my way. I'll be by your side, never to divide. The light that shines our way. Wherever you road leads, we'll make your dreams come true. Next side, next side, next side, next to you.
Nexa Credit Union, with you wherever your road leads.
Paging all Grenadians at home and in the diaspora to be part of the journey to 50, reflecting on the past, planning for the future as we get ready to celebrate our 49th anniversary of independence. Tuesday, February 7th, 2023. Events to be observed for our 49th anniversary of independence include table tennis tournament at the CSA building, February 3rd and February 4th. Independence Calypso Finals, Sutter's Bus Terminal, 8 p.m. February 3rd, February 4th. Open water swimming competition, Grand Mall Beach at 9 a.m. and beach tennis at Grandad's Beach from 11 a.m. Also the Independence Boxing Tournament, February 4th, 8 p.m. at the Youth Center, National Independence Church Service, Grenada Trade Center, Sunday, February 5th, 3 p.m. National Colors Day, the Inter-Ministerial Display, and the 49th Cultural Extravaganza, 7 p.m. at the Granville Burst Terminal, February 6th. Then the Made in Grenada Expo, Military Parade and Rally, 10 a.m. at the Kirani James Athletic Stadium, Tuesday, February 7th. Happy 49th, Grenada.
Yes, good day, it's your boy Graphics, and I'm fully endorsing 473 Colors Boat Ride is happening this Saturday aboard the Rum Runner 2. You know the code, get your ticket $65, barbecue included. The boarding 7, we still in 8 o'clock. Graphics and the full team gonna be on the boat, and we outside this Saturday. Don't miss it, you know. Rep your color, bring out your family, bring out your friends. Still in the ICs, Rum Runner 2, look out. We're coming up 98 to the world.
You're watching Our Climate Reality on GBN Television, brought to you in part by the Climate Resilient Water Sector in Grenada and Hubbards.
Welcome back, everyone. This evening, our guest, Mr. Gerard Thema, he's a meteorological forecaster at the MBIA, and of course, Dr. Cedric Van Beerbeck, a climatologist with the Meteorological Institute, or the Caribbean Institute of Meteorology and Hydrology. My co-host this evening, Dr. Terence Walters. Before we get into the discussion, Mr. Thema, briefly, tell us about yourself. 30 seconds.
Well, first of all, good night, Godfrey, and good night to Dr. Walters, host, and a special good night to my good friend, Dr. Cedric. We work closely together through the various Caribbean initiatives. Well, I'm a forecaster at the Point Salines Met Office. I'm a position I'm holding now for about the last 10 or so years. Within those years, as a forecaster, I now have special responsibility for the climate services of the department. So I guess that's why I'm here. Over the years, it has been quite a privilege to see this service grow, and look into the future. We see that a lot more demands are being placed on this service, especially for climate service related information on climate services in general. So as a whole climate sensitive nation continue to increase, and our customers and stakeholders become more demanding and more sophisticated in their demands of the office, we do like programs like this where we can come out and talk to the nation to help in the whole idea of public education and public awareness of climate change and climate on a whole.
Thank you, Mr. Thema. Dr. Maybank, can you tell us a little bit about yourself?
Evening, just checking that you can hear me.
Yes, we are.
Okay, great. My name is Cedric, in full Dr. Cedric Van Meerbeek. I'm indeed the climatologist at the Caribbean Institute for Meteorology and Hydrology, which is located in your neighbor island of Barbados. So my role is threefold, I would say. First and foremost, my role within climate services, as we call it, which is providing and utilizing climate information for decision making, is to be able to build the capacity of the meteorological services of the Caribbean nations to deliver that kind of information. And that goes all the way from research to development of products and services, to training of the forecasters and climatologists and whatnot, as well as to interact with the users such that the products and the services that are delivered are most relevant for their use, for their benefit, for better decision making. A second hat I wear is I'm also a lecturer at the University of the West Indies here in Barbados, and I teach on climatology, on oceans and climate, etc. But I also train undergrad and graduate students in their research, in their prospects. And thirdly, I serve with the UN body that brings together all the meteorological services of the world, which is the World Meteorological Organization, in which I serve as the chair or co-chair of an expert team that deals with climate services in North America, Central America, and the Caribbean. So from those three hats, I'm really, really thankful to be given the opportunity to share a little bit about about climate and climate change, and how do we break down those words, those terminologies? What do they really mean for us? Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Merbek. And of course, my co-host this evening, Dr. Terence Walters. Not a stranger, but Terry, 30 seconds. Yes.
Good evening to all viewers, all listeners, and it's really good to be here. I'm not a climate expert per se, all right. I work in disaster management. I'm currently the National Disaster Coordinator here in Grenada, and so you would realize that the whole issue of climate change and disaster management are closely related. So we need to ensure that we understand what is happening in climate change, so that as disaster management practitioners, and we hear about disaster risk reduction and a whole number of terms in terms of disaster, right? Disaster management. So we need to understand what is happening with climate change so that disaster management practitioners can be prepared to respond, and we can provide the population with the right information so that we know how to respond. And one of the other things I want to mention here is early warning systems. We need to ensure that our population understand what the early warning systems are and how they need to respond.
Right, thank you, Terry, and of course we'll be getting into all that. But of course, we are talking climate change, but I think we need to just backtrack a little bit. Climate change, what is climate? If we do not understand what climate is, we may be lost when it comes to understanding the changes or the variations that are occurring. So let's invite Cedric, Dr. Cedric, to share with us a bit on that. Climate, what is climate? And then we move on to the issue of climate change and the concept of climate change.
So would it be possible to load the slides at this time?
Yes, we can.
Thank you. That would be the other presenter, I believe.
Let's welcome the right.
While we await the loading of the slides, let me just mention why it is so critical. As the National Disaster Coordinator, Terry has told you, climate change and how we deal with it has a lot to do with disaster management, disaster prevention, but also getting adapted to changes we know are going to occur, and hopefully also play our parts in avoiding the worst of climate change. But as you rightfully mentioned, Godfrey, climate change involves the word climate, so we need to understand what climate really is. And so I've tried to break it down to language that is not too much geared towards scientists alone, but that most of you should be able to readily understand. The first thing I want to mention is that climate and weather are often used in the same breath. And there are differences. And the reasons why there are differences is that although the scientists that do either or the other, one or the other, they're very similar in their training, climate is in general what you can expect, whereas weather is what you get. What do we mean by that? For instance, imagine that in the worst case, a hurricane were to come towards the Caribbean, and that hurricane is about to hit a certain island, let's call it Caribe. Then 2 days in advance, you really want to know how bad is it going to get? How can I do my last preparations to respond to whatever category of hurricane there will be? Hopefully I wouldn't have to, but we don't know yet. We didn't know yet until 2 days in advance whether that hurricane would come or not. So now we do. And so the fact that the hurricane is coming 2 days from now, that is a weather forecast. Now, climate is saying, for instance, the time in the year when you find that most hurricanes take place is what we call the hurricane season. And everybody is familiar with the hurricane season, which starts officially on the 1st of June and ends on the 30th of November, which means that most of the hurricanes that have occurred in the past and most that we expect in the future happen within that 6-month time period. Note that I say most. So it's the expectation that in the hurricane season, one would see a few or a number of hurricanes. So that's the climate side of things. But each individual storm, each individual hurricane is weather. So if we look back at our slide, it has actually a better definition of what climate is. One could define it as the state, and that's including what is normal, what is the usual state, and what are some of the extremes of patterns in our weather, patterns in our ocean, patterns in our vegetation, patterns in many parts of the world that form the so-called climate system. I'll get to that in a second. And this is changes and variations and averages over a period of time that ranges from several weeks to thousands or even millions of years. So what do we understand as a climate system? Well, from a physical perspective, a system, you could use the analogy of a car. A car is comprised of different components that are mounted together. Each component has its own set of parts, and it has to be built in a certain structure in order for a car to be able to work. But the car will only run once it's given fuel. Same thing for the climate system. It's the interaction of a structure of gases, water in various phases. By that we mean the frozen phase, or ice and snow, liquid and water vapor, the gaseous phase, but also rocks and minerals and all the living matter on Earth. And by those interactions of that structure, we get what we see as our climate. Next slide, please.
You're watching Our Climate Reality.
Thank you. So then what is climate change? Well, climate change can be defined officially, there are long definitions, but just to give you a simpler definition, climate change can be defined as the observed, reconstructed, and/or anticipated changes in at least some components of the climate system, whether you're looking in the atmosphere where all the gases are located, or whether you're looking in the oceans, or whether you're looking in the vegetation. Once there's changes in at least some of them, then we can talk about climate change once it's on the long term. But that is a very vague definition, so I like using a more practical definition that is still correct enough to be called scientific. Climate change can be defined as the climate system changes that are, so to speak, forced by an increase or decrease in the amount of available energy. So imagine that the sun became stronger and released more energy onto the Earth. Well, what would happen? The climate would get warmer because it has more energy in the atmosphere, in the oceans, on the Earth's surface, etc. And because we define climate change in this practical manner as something forced from outside the system, in other words, you make the fuel more or less efficient, you add fuel or you remove fuel, that is very different from what we call climate variability, which are internal variations within the climate system. In other words, once the climate is going, there will be times when it will be wetter or drier, warmer or cooler, that there will be more active hurricane seasons or less active hurricane season, etc. So that is what we mean by climate change. Next slide, please. Now, what does climate change actually look like in our region? Well, what we already see in terms of long-term trends, so trends over time scales of decades and longer, is that heat stress is really on the rise. Heat stress is how heat affects your body or the body of an animal or the body of a plant in terms of making you feel stressed, physical stress that reduces the efficiency of the working of your body. So you feel stressed because of how the heat feels around you. We know with high confidence that that heat stress has already been rising very fast in the region. The second thing that has been rising is sea levels. Sea levels, even if global warming were to be halted in the foreseeable future, and heat stress, both of them, we are really pretty sure that they will continue rising. This is as soon as started in the 1980s or so, but especially now in the 2020s, we're gonna feel more and more heat stress. Then later, continue please. Later, as we approach the 2050s, what we will see, likely as well, is that we get more frequent and more intense major hurricanes. So those are the dangerous ones that are going to become more frequent and more intense, with more damages, unfortunately, unless we prepare well, of course. More frequent and intense droughts, as well as dry spells, which means the amount of water that we have right now might not be the same amount of water that we can utilize in future. Finally, increased flash flood and flooding intensity. That is, of course, very important when we need to prepare to avoid the calamities that come with flash floods, which can go anywhere from landslides or displaced communities or crops that are destroyed, etc. Now, we do expect increased intensity of flash floods and long-term flooding, but reduced frequency. So these are the hazards that go together with climate change as we see happening now and into the future.
Right.
Over.
Yep. Thank you very much, Dr. Meerbeek. Terry, any quick questions you want to ask before we go to Mr. Thema? Or would you like to address Mr. Thema?
I just wanted to ask Dr. Meerbeek here. We hear about sea level rise. If he can be a little bit more specific, because people may think, well, sea level rise, but they're not seeing it in certain places. Can you just be a little bit more specific, or if there's any example you can point to?
Sure, thank you, Terry. Sea level rise is something that we can't see readily because it's happening too slow for the naked eye to be able to observe. You actually have to measure it over the years, but the impacts of which are already felt. Grand Anse Beach, if I understand well, has at some point been heavily damaged by beach erosion, part of which was caused by a rise in sea level by about 20 centimeters. And one would say 20 centimeters, that's nothing. I mean, the tides are larger than that, or sometimes the tide is more than a meter higher. So why do we care about 20 centimeters? Well, there are a few reasons. One of which is if there's a hurricane and the hurricane is bringing you storm surge leads to higher water levels. But if 20 centimeters of sea level rise has already occurred, that means that those storm surge levels happen on top of those 20 centimeters. And so instead of 1 meter of storm surge, now you get 1 meter and 20 centimeters, or 4 feet if you wish. Now, 4 feet of storm surge and storm tide can indeed lead to quite substantial damage. And that's not even a strong hurricane. So what we see is, for instance, in the case of hurricanes, that storm surge becomes more dangerous because of sea level rise. Another example is, as the sea level is rising, the salt in the water intrudes into the underground and makes our land more salty. Now, Now, I know if you're a farmer, you know very well that salt in the ground is not good for your crops to grow. So that is one of the challenges that we face, especially in low elevations. And thirdly, most importantly, one should bear in mind that more than 70% of the world's population, and also a sizable proportion of the population in the Caribbean, lives very close to sea level. And so that means that any sea level rise, which is now accelerating, and by the end of the century is estimated to be 0.5 meter to 1 meter higher, in the best of cases, that means that there will be at some point community displacement. I'm talking about the end of this century, but if you look 300 years ahead in time, which is maybe not so relevant for us right now in our decision making, but just imagine generations 300 years later, sea level might be many meters higher than it is today, or many tens of feet higher than today. And that means that almost all capitals of the Caribbean would be submerged. Over.
Terry, yeah. So let's go over to Mr. Tema, or maybe let's take our second commercial break. When we come back from the break, then we would bring in Mr. Tema to speak with us on climate versus weather.
Our Climate Reality is brought to you in part by the Climate Resilient Water Sector in Grenada and Hubbards.
Do you have muscular pain that no one can find a solution for? Are you tired of taking meds for joint and other pains? Hills and Valley Medicare Center on Grenville Street, St. George is here to help you heal. We will help you map a path to your full recovery. Visit us Monday to Saturday for a consultation with our on-site doctor, physiotherapist, and massage team. You will be glad you did. Our Medicare Center, a proud member of the Hills and Valley group of companies. On the hilltop or in the valley, we are with you wherever life takes you. Hills and Valley Pharmacy. Your health is our business.
Have you heard about the new soft-weave bathroom tissue with total hygiene? As hygiene and safety have taken center stage, our bathroom tissue is now manufactured with 3 different technologies to offer the best protection for you and your family. UVC light technology for a safe and effective disinfection process, eliminating 99.9% of microorganisms. Also, production at high temperatures, killing all types of germs and bacteria. And it's pH controlled with delicate fibers to prevent irritation for even sensitive skin. Softweave Total Hygiene Bathroom Tissue, available in supermarkets and shops island-wide. Visit Softweave Caribbean Facebook or Instagram pages for more information.
Rep your colors. Hot 98 presents the 473 Colors Boat Ride. Going on Saturday, February 4. Get your tickets now at godfrey.com for only $65. Food included. Boarding time 7 p.m. The boat sails at 7:30. Music on board by the Hot 98 DJs plus other guest DJs.
Baby, calm down, calm down.
Rep your colors on the boat, cause this one here is gonna be epic. Lock the date, Saturday, February 4th. Hot 98 473 Colors Boat Ride. Don't you miss this.
Welcome back, everyone, to our climate change reality. And of course, those of you who joined us late, our guest this evening, Mr. Jared Tema, forecaster at the MBIA, and of course, Dr. Cedric Van Meerbeek of the CIMH. Mr. Tema, Dr. Cedric earlier made reference to climate and weather. Not a lot of details. So can you just speak to us a bit about that, the climate versus weather, because this is something that I think is confused by many.
Okay, sure, Godfrey. And as Cedric rightly said, there are 2 terms that people use interchangeably, and that's a common mistake. The big difference between them is the time scales. Let's look at it in a local context. what is our climate in Grenada? It's basically what we expect. Now, we are into the dry season, and when we look at the different atmospheric parameters, we notice that they behave in a particular way at this time of the year. No, that is our climate. We expect low rainfall, low relative humidity, lower temperatures, stronger winds because we have the migration of the Bermuda Azores Heights closer to our region, so we get the stronger winds where we say kite season, Easter breeze, So we expect that sort of behavior from the atmosphere. So that is our climate. Okay? But what happens if we wake up this morning or early in the morning and we have a little shower? You see? Now that is weather because that is a shorter time scale. And we can look further down the year. When we get into the rainy season, we expect, and that is what we say is our climate. We expect higher temperatures, more rainfall. Okay, that's where we enter the hurricane season. We expect the various elements of the atmosphere to behave in a particular way. So that is what is our climate. How we expect the atmosphere to behave in a particular time, at a particular place. And normally those parameters are observed over like a 30-year period. Okay? So that's when we show that is exactly how it's going to happen. Of course, you will have times when they will have extreme events, okay? But on average, when you look at the behavior of the atmosphere over a particular period, and normally the climatic mean is 30 years, okay, you can say, okay, this is how we expect the atmosphere to behave at this particular time, so that is climate. However, on a shorter time scale, a day, 2 days, an hour or so, that is weather, a shorter time scale. The same parameters, but they behave differently on a shorter time scale. So that's the difference we have to make. And I think slowly and surely the population is getting to notice the difference. And it's all in public education, and the two are being used less and less in conflict still. But we still have a lot of public education to separate the two.
All right. Thank you, Mr. Tima. Dr. Walters?
So we sorry, you mentioned 30 years. So if we go back to possibly 1990, 80s thereabout, have we noticed anything in particular with our weather, with our climate? Climate because it's long term. Anything that you want to point out that we've noticed?
Oh yeah, sure. Now, when we look at our local data, and that is what we collect at Point Saline, okay, there are two things that are pretty much very striking. The first thing, let's look at the rainfall. Our rainfall, we have the dry season at the beginning of the year, and then we get into a wet season. So normally, if you do a rainfall graph, you have generally a gentle curve, as you come towards the second half of the year. Okay? Over the last maybe 10 to 15 years, what we've noticed is that the rainfall curve has gotten very erratic, some spikes. There's not that gentle curve that we used to have maybe 20 or 30 years ago. For example, Cedric spoke about, for the disaster people, the things for flash floods and so. In 2021, if you look at our rainfall statistic, it will show that we have an average rainfall for that year. But when you look at the months, August, September, October, November, we all had, these months were below average rainfall and far below average rainfall. But then, June and July were very, very wet months out of the extremes. You see? So the rainfall, we are seeing some more sporadic rainfall events. And another point that stands out, when we look at the minimum temperature, as we call it at Point Saline, okay? Now, on close scrutiny, the highest minimum temperatures for the last 30 or 35 years is constantly rising. Okay. Now, in the 1980s and 1990s, we were getting peaking at 25 plus, sometime at 26 plus. Okay. But in the last 10 or so years, the 26 plus are becoming more and more frequent. And we are now getting some 27s. Wow. Okay? Wow. Okay? And this is all happening right here with our data that we are collecting. Okay? Okay? So this, of course, have some implication for life and health, health especially. Okay, we know it shows that even as the Earth is warming, or if even though the daytime temperature stays the same, the Earth is not cooling as much as it used to. And we hear about it happening all over the world, but right here in Grenada, based on the data that we collect, it's happening right before our very eyes. Okay?
Thank you, Mr. Tima. Just moving on, I want to now go back to Dr. Cedric. And of course, I think both himself and Mr. Tima mentioned the term global warming, and we hear of that as well, global warming, and it's mentioned together with climate change. Dr. Meyerbeck, global warming, climate change, are they the same, or is there some difference between the two? Or how does one influence the other?
Sure, that is a very good question, and that is a question that many people should ask themselves in a similar way as if you go to the doctor and you have a symptom. Your symptom is you have a sore throat, but your disease is you have a flu. The symptom, global warming, is indicative of climate change. So global warming is the global average temperature of the Earth at the surface, so that means at sea level, and how that has warmed since the Industrial Revolution that took place in the 18th and the 19th century, when we started using industrialized methods and thereby started emitting CO2 and other greenhouse gases in the atmosphere. We'll get to that in a bit. But basically, we started in a much faster way, adding energy to the climate system. And so I want to go back to just where global warming stands and climate change having global warming as one of its clearest features. So climate change is, as we said, any kind of change in the interactions between water and gases and plants, etc. Whereas global warming is really just the rise in temperature since the Industrial Revolution and the expected continuation. But there are very close parallels between global warming, which is the warming of the average temperature, and the increase in energy that is available in the climate system. And because there's increased energy, imagine that you have a pot of water, and you put that pot of water to boil. That means you're adding energy, or you're turning up the gas, in other words, to warm up that water. At some point, what you're going to see is that that water is no longer standing still, but there will be gas bubbles forming, and the water will be moving erratically up and down and sideways. This is what happens when we observe extremes, climate extremes. And so whereas the average temperature of the Earth is rising, what we see is rising even faster is the number of heat waves, is the number of times or the frequency of times that we're getting uncomfortable with the heat. And mind you, heat stress has really bad consequences that we are not very aware of, even in the Caribbean. If everybody remembers Hurricane Maria of 2017 that devastated Dominica and then devastated Puerto Rico, by far most of the deaths in Puerto Rico were not because of the wind strength. The wind actually knocked out power, and it's the lack of power together with the lack of good shelter and a heat wave right after the hurricane that heat wave that brought people that were no longer sheltered against the heat could not cool themselves down, and therefore nearly 2,000 people died just because of the heat after the impact of a hurricane. So global warming, short, is a symptom of climate change.
Okay, thank you very much. But, there's a follow-up question, and you just explained what can happen as a result of global warming. But what really causes global warming? What is responsible for, our world or atmosphere getting warmer? Is the sun getting hotter or some other phenomenon causing that? Dr. Mehrbeck?
Sorry, I got interrupted for 1 second. Can you hear me?
Yes, I'm hearing you now.
Yes.
Did you hear my question?
I believe I heard the major portion of it, so I can have a start, and feel free to interrupt me anytime you want.
Sure.
So global warming, as we said, is the main symptom of climate change that we can readily observe. For instance, the Met Services, who measure the temperatures every day, they can see that the temperatures are rising. As Mr. Tamar said, the nighttime temperatures are more frequently staying quite warm to a point where they're uncomfortable. But what is behind that? Well, climate change, if you remember, is a change in that structure of gases and water, etc., that is caused by a change in the amount of energy that is available in the climate system. What is the original heat source? What is the original energy source for our climate? That is the sun. The sun has changed in its lifetime in the amount of energy that's shown upon the earth. So climate change has happened since the beginning of Earth's existence, and since particularly the Earth has an atmosphere. But what is now different is that we as humans, we've started interfering with our climate in a way that is not natural. We have started to pump more energy into the climate by burning fossil fuels. When you burn fossil fuels, what happens is you release so-called CO2 or carbon dioxide. Carbon dioxide, which is one of the most well-known, what is called greenhouse gases. Now, just like being in a greenhouse, I'm not sure how many people have had the opportunity of being in a greenhouse, but if there's a lot of sunshine and you're sitting in a greenhouse, you'll feel the temperature get warmer and warmer and warmer and warmer. Why? Because the heat gets trapped inside the greenhouse and cannot escape. Similar with greenhouse gases, what a molecule like CO2 can do is it can trap some of the heat that doesn't come from the sun, but that comes from the earth and that goes outward to space. So the sun shines energy on the earth absorbs it, and then the earth will re-emit some of that energy out into space. But if the CO2 molecule can capture some heat as it goes out and then bring it back down, that means that more energy stays into the atmosphere and moves into the ocean, moves into the plant life, etc., and thereby causing global warming as one of the symptoms of climate change. But once you increase the energy levels, remember that pot of boiling water, things go left and right in a seemingly chaotic way. What you then observe is that climatic changes can really take on quite violent consequences, quite bad impacts that we need to prepare for.
Right. Dr. Walters, any questions you would like to?
Well, I am looking at the whole issue of the, the greenhouse gases and the CO2, but I mean, is there anything that we as a people can do? I mean, without getting into much detail, are there things that we should be doing to reduce?
Thank you for that question. Yes, definitely the only safe way to reduce the extent of climate change is by reducing the greenhouse gas emissions. that we have been emitting more massively and more rapidly ever since the Industrial Revolution. What can we do in our small island nations in the Caribbean is to primarily be good examples to others and to, through advocacy, make sure that the world hears our cry that we need to protect our future generations. Small island developing states are very skewedly affected, more so than large countries, most large countries, by climate change, because there are so many hazards related to climate that occur in the Caribbean, that occur in the Pacific Islands, that occur in the Indian Ocean Islands, that we have to grapple with so many different disasters all at once sometimes. And that is really, really hard. But the other thing is, we are going to be more influential on the global scale if we speak with a concerted voice. And so the Caribbean has been rallying together with the Pacific Islands for something we call 1.5 to stay alive. That means a global warming range of 1.5 degrees above pre-industrial climate. So that means the climate we had before we started emitting a lot of CO2, that 1.5 would be a safer bet for our economies, for our environment, for our health, etc., than anything that exceeds the 1.5 limit. And whereas globally before the 1.5 to stay alive campaign, people thought that once we keep climate change and global warming to a level that is a little bit more extensive, so 2 degrees, that would be safe. No, through science, we have been able to demonstrate that the safe bet is really 1.5 degrees. And because we rallied together in the international agenda, we've made a point so clearly and so loudly as one that the world has adopted that statement that we need to make sure that our climate does not warm excessively and preferably below 1.5 degrees. Because otherwise, my friends, I'm sorry to say, but there will be negative consequences that are hard to deal with. Many of them we can still deal with, but it will require a lot of collaboration across the world, and some of the things will be outside our control as a small island developing states region. But that's not to say that we should lose hope, because there is a lot happening on the climate change front. And more importantly, necessity, as you all know, is the mother of all innovations. So once the need gets highest, it gets easier for our civilization to get together and tackle the problem once and for all. So my hope is in that mechanism, that we will band together before it is too late.
Thank you very much, Dr. Cedric. Gentlemen, we're practically out of time in our program this week, this premiere, but there is so much more to cover, and next Wednesday we will continue. So what we'll do now, I'll just ask both Dr. Cedric and Mr. Tima to give us some closing word. Anything out of our discussion that you would like to re-emphasize or highlight to our listeners before we wrap for this evening? Let's start with Mr. Tima.
Okay, thank you, Godfrey. The whole idea of climate change and global warming for most people is something they hear on the news, okay? But I can tell you, based on the statistics we have at Point Celine, the data we collect, is very much, it has arrived in Grenada, okay? Our temperatures, especially our minimum temperatures, are increasing. Grenada is getting hotter, okay? All we have to do is to just learn to adapt, learn to do the things that are necessary to preserve life. There was a very good study conducted recently, Godfrey, by Dr. Glasgow at the SGU, which shows a very interesting correlation between health and temperature, heat, okay? And you will be surprised to know that the amount of hospital admissions that are caused when the temperature is high. Okay? So these things are really happening in Grenada. Right here is no longer something you hear on TV. It's something that we are living, we are experiencing at the moment. So it is so important for us as a nation to be conscious of it, to be educated, to make informed decisions of our climate. So we thank you again for this opportunity, and we look forward to the next time.
Thank you very much, Mr. Tima. Dr. Maybeck, your closing words, anything you would like to leave with our listeners?
Sure, and thank you, Mr. Tamar, my good friend, that you address the issue of heat as a hazard, because this is not something that we're familiar with in the Caribbean. The Caribbean is a nice place because the climate is nice, or so we think. Just to give you an idea that you might actually care about as well, is for kids in school that are subject to temperatures above 22 degrees Celsius, that's above 72 degrees Fahrenheit. Every single half degree Celsius or every degree Fahrenheit higher than that limit means 1% reduced learning capacity of your child at school. Now, I realize we don't have the money to have ACs all across the schools. That's not going to happen. However, there are ways in which we can make a difference. One way is to rally for more shading and more ventilation in our schools, or at least to maximize ventilation in our schools, and make sure that the kids do not play in the sunshine in the heat of the day. Just to give you an example there, for a child who's been playing for half an hour in the sunlight in the middle of the day, their heart rate is about 10 beats per minute faster after that half hour, just because of the heat. And their core body temperature, think of fever. Fever means your body temperature is rising and you don't feel as good, you don't function as well. Your body temperature also gets higher as a child faster than an adult. So let's protect our kids, and if we want them to play outside during the lunch break particularly, let's make sure there's enough shading in place to protect our children. But those are just two examples that I bring on top of the very relevant example that Mr. Tamar provided you, to say that heat is the new hazard to look out for, because it's coming at us and it's coming at us fast. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Maybeck. Dr. Walters, your closing?
Well, this discourse is quite timely, it's quite relevant. And as we talk about disaster management, we talk about disaster risk reduction, and we talk about early warning systems. We talk about all these terms. We must have a better understanding of climate change and how it fits into the whole disaster management, disaster risk reduction sphere, and what we need to do, how we need to work together, and there should be greater collaboration among the various entities that deal with disaster management, climate change, and how we go forward. So I look forward to this, and I want to say to you, Godfrey, congratulate you on this initiative, and I look forward to the discourse as we go forward.
Thank you very much, Dr. Walters. Well, folks, that's all the time we have this evening on our climate reality. In the program, we heard of the greenhouse effect briefly. Next week, we will be going into that. We heard of greenhouse gases. Carbon dioxide was mentioned. There are other greenhouse gases. So we do have a lot to talk about. And of course, you can join us next week. There's also the natural versus human-induced climate change. And so next Wednesday at 8 o'clock, do join us for our second edition of our Climate Reality. Do have a good night.
Climate Reality is brought to you in part by the Climate Resilient Water Sector in Grenada and Hubbards.